1,000 years before the idea was even thought of in the West, the Chinese used drilling rigs like these to exploit their vast resources of salt and natural gas that lay 2,000 feet below the Earth's surface. The salt industry here in Sichuan province suggests the genius that was China at the height of its glory between the years 1000 and 1400. In this reenactment, a rhythmic dance lifts, then drops the heavy iron bit, which gradually works its way through the rock and earth below. The sophistication of the technology, the organization of manpower, the scale of the enterprise were all superior to anything European culture could offer at the time. Ruled by the emperors of the Sung dynasty, China in the year 1000 was the center of civilization. Its crafts and products were manufactured on a grand scale and were coveted throughout the breadth of the known world. China's scientific skill and its technological accomplishments placed it at the cutting edge of knowledge in the medieval world. Chinese goods, and with them Chinese ideas and culture, were carried to the far reaches of the globe, to Java and Luzon, across the Indian Ocean to Persia, and overland, ultimately, to Europe. The China trade provided material evidence of the glory that was the Sung Empire. China was legendary as a land of wealth, peace, and extraordinary beauty. This is China today, or rather a hint of what China might become. Here in Shenzhen, a showcase special economic zone, the Chinese have built in less than a decade a thoroughly modern city, modeled on the cities of the West. Shenzhen is emblematic of China's first cautious steps toward the consumer society. Here in Shenzhen's factories, Chinese workers assemble the high-technology spin-offs of Western science. But Shenzhen is the exception. And despite the signs of change that can be read in its billboards and its broad new avenues, China possesses as well a very different face. This, too, is China today. The China where 80% of the people live on the land, tilling the fields in a manner that would have been familiar 1,000 years ago. For the last several centuries, the rhythms of Chinese life have remained largely untouched by the scientific and technological revolutions that swept across Europe. Yet China had long possessed the basic tools that European nations use to grasp wealth and power: the compass, books printed on paper, which fostered the spread of ideas and inventions, astronomical instruments that made their knowledge of the heavens as acute as any in the ancient world, and the most famous of all of the Chinese inventions, gunpowder. But while Europeans exploited these discoveries, they all originated in China. To this day, the creators and architects of China's spectacular accomplishments like the great early official Li Bing, are remembered and revered. Showing respect and reverence for such scholars remains central to Chinese culture. For this family, a visit to the temple dedicated to the great early official Li Bing is a chance to demonstrate their respect. For them, Li Bing is a model of the selfless official who worked to improve the lot of others. Yet, teaching respect is no easy task, even in China. It was Li Bing who is credited with founding the salt industry in Sichuan, establishing the salt wells there as early as 250 BC. For the next 1,000 years, generations of Chinese dug the wells and harnessed the buffalo to haul the salt brine up to the surface. The ropes are made of braided bamboo, whose tensile strength is as great as steel. Hollow bamboo tubes are used to hoist the brine from the depths. The salt wells also yielded methane gas, which was trapped in barrels and then used to fuel the fires that boiled off the brine, leaving pure salt behind. The efficiency of the system allowed the vats to operate 24 hours a day and produce salt of the very highest quality. In the ancient world, salt was essential to survival. It was used to preserve food, and in 13th century China, its sale was a highly profitable business. Salt was one of the great imperial monopolies, which from time to time included iron, tea, silk, porcelain, and even ginseng. These vast enterprises were run by a class of men unique in the medieval world, the imperial bureaucrats, among whom were found a very few non-Chinese. One such foreigner served for a time as an official in the salt trade. His name was Marco Polo. In 1287, Marco Polo, together with his father and uncle, came from Venice as merchants, seeking the riches of Cathay. In the event, Marco was captivated by the Celestial Empire, and his diary is one of the best reports of China at its height. He wrote, "Our route continued through a region of bounding and thriving cities and towns. Through every part of the city it is possible to travel either by land or by stream. The streets and watercourses alike are very wide, so that carts and boats can readily pass along them to carry provisions for the inhabitants. The people are rich in silks and many other articles of commerce, and are skillful traders and craftsmen. In this way, they are amply provided with the means of life." Marco told medieval Europe of wonders, of gardens, and of palaces so extraordinary he felt compelled to say that nothing he had written was false. Everything he recorded he had seen with his own eyes as he passed in the service of the most famous ruler of China, the Emperor Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was himself a foreigner, a Mongol invader. Originally a nomad, Kublai was faced with the task of ruling a vast, rich, and settled land. To do so, he drew upon the remarkable culture of statecraft that the Chinese had derived from the teachings of the philosopher Confucius, who lived in the 5th century BC.
Confucianism was a very simple set of ideas Confucius and his disciples worked out, but they were based on something already there, the Chinese family, which they then articulated principles to explain and to consolidate. And at the heart of it all, the family relationship is the base. It is the model upon which all other human relations should follow. And then it became quite sophisticated about how the members of family, clans, and so on should behave towards one another, and extended that to the rest of society. That if the whole society consisted of a number of well-organized clans and families, all well-integrated and harmoniously developing within itself, then those values would also become prevalent in all of society. And the kind of values of filial piety can easily be translated into loyalty towards the emperor. And that's where the two ends, as it were, meet beautifully. Ending with loyalty to the emperor, so the emperor couldn't have asked for more.
This family-based model and the profound loyalties it inspired linked the emperor to the great mass of his subjects, the peasants who tilled the soil and who paid the taxes that supported the Chinese state. But in an empire the size of all Europe, a ruler needed a special class of assistants to keep order and to maintain public works. Especially when at least one province per year throughout Chinese history was threatened by drought, famine, or flood. Chinese farmers have always depended for their survival on the flow of water to the land. China's rivers still carry the rich silt that has for centuries enabled the Chinese to support themselves on a fraction of the land traditionally required in Europe. But the silt comes at a price, the threat of devastating floods. So for any Chinese ruler, it was essential to control and manage the water, which sustained the agricultural system. This Chinese feature film honors the accomplishments of those who first did control the water. The flooding on the Minjiang River regularly devastated the villages of the Chengdu Plains in Sichuan. The hero of this film is none other than Li Bing, shown here trying to control the panicking crowd. He is still celebrated more than 2,000 years later for his achievement in taming the river. To prevent the flooding, Li Bing designed an ingenious system of canals, which would both control the rampaging water and provide irrigation for the plains. Today, with some modern additions, the system is still in use. This is the island Li Bing had built up to divide the river. The outer channel carries the fast-falling water directly downstream to the Yangtze River. The nearer one guides the slower flow into the irrigation canals. When the river rises, it spills back over this weir into the outer channel, preventing any flooding in the irrigation ditches. Building the massive public works and fortifications of ancient China demanded both great technological skill and vast numbers of people. The administration of this workforce led to one of China's most significant accomplishments, the emergence of a group of officials dedicated to the managing of all the needs of empire, the first professional bureaucrats. In time, these men adopted the teachings of Confucius as their theory of government, one which they used to administer the empire and to control the great mass of people whose labor transformed the face of the Chinese landscape. China's early adoption of bureaucracy was linked to another great technological accomplishment, the invention of paper and of printing, the essential tools of government. From early in their history, the Chinese had carved their important literature, like these Confucian texts, onto stone tablets. The first step toward printing was to use the new inventions, paper and ink, to make a rubbing. These sheets could be cut into pages and bound into books. From stone tablet to the woodblock was only a short leap. These priests are reprinting a collection of original woodblocks of religious texts compiled 500 years ago. The first printed book in China was probably a Buddhist scripture called the Diamond Sutra, published in 868 AD. Orthodox Confucian scholars swiftly made use of the new technology. Printing standardized the text of the Confucian classics, the commentaries and interpretations which a would-be statesman would have to master. And the mass production of books made possible the broad distribution of a unified body of Chinese knowledge. Printing technology fostered the third great invention of Chinese statecraft, the civil service, and the examination that selected out the best men in the empire for their position in the bureaucratic hierarchy. The tests were the world's oldest written examinations, and they were based on the detailed learning of the Confucian classics that taught the 5 virtues of benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and trustworthiness. By the Sung dynasty, these exams were accepted as the only legitimate path to power and status within the empire. As this Chinese film recalls, the examination system was the major event in the political and social calendar of Chinese life. The exams were administered at 3 levels: imperial, provincial, and county. Bells were rung at 4 in the morning, and the ordeal would begin. Up to 30,000 scholars would attempt the lowest levels of the exams, and it would have taken the candidates 6 years of arduous study to get just this far. Upon his performance in these tiny cells depended an aspirant's future career, social status, and the prosperity of his family. For this reason, enormous efforts were made to make these exams as fair as possible. Once in the examination hall, candidates would be identified only by a number. Written work would be recopied to prevent favored students from being identified by their calligraphy. And with so much at stake, it's little wonder that some students tried to cheat. Silk crib sheets like this one, containing key passages from Confucian classics and sample essays, would be hidden in clothing, in food, and anywhere else the wit of man could devise. Despite such unworthy practices, the exam system for almost 1,500 years did select out men of intelligence to run the empire. During the Song, the tradition of Confucian scholarship was at its most vigorous and dynamic, and it was these men who both ran the government and presided over the greatest flowering of Chinese scientific and technological inquiry. As always, the first priority of the imperial scholars was the agricultural system. To cultivate the elaborate network of irrigated fields, the Chinese invented new techniques and new machines. And between the years 1000 and 1200, the Sung officials presided over a green revolution that transformed Chinese agriculture into the most productive system of farming the world had ever seen. This device is called a dragon's backbone pump, and it is still used in China today. Its development required a sophisticated understanding of the principles of mechanical advantage, and it enabled a single man to lift large quantities of water. Imperial officials promoted the use of such devices, and with woodblock illustrations like these, they disseminated the new inventions in handbooks and encyclopedias. This enabled landowners anywhere in China to take advantage of innovations made anywhere else in China. Of all the discoveries made around this time, one was to have an enormous impact. This Sung encyclopedia reports on champa rice, imported from the southern province of Annam, now Vietnam, around 1012 AD. Champa rice was a fast-growing strain, and it, along with several other new plants, enabled China's peasants to grow 2 and even 3 crops per year. The central importance of the harvest lay at the heart of Chinese statecraft and was recognized with the ritual of the emperor plowing the first furrow of the season. Such rituals emphasized the bond between the ruler and his domain. The requirements of the agricultural year also led to what became one of traditional China's most important scientific pursuits, astronomy. Every year, on behalf of the emperor, calendars were published to coordinate ritual and agricultural events like planting or the opening and closing of irrigation canals. The animals depict different months. The rat, the monkey, and the snake are marked as being lucky. The calendars were also used to predict auspicious heavenly events such as eclipses of the sun and moon. The emperor ruled by the mandate of heaven. He was entitled to rule, in Confucian terms, only so long as he ruled well, and as long as heaven showed, by good portents and the absence of disasters, that the emperor was fulfilling his responsibilities. This modern observatory in Nanjing continues the tradition of observation of the heavens that served the emperors of China as an ancient intelligence service. Both the emperor and his bureaucrats could review their performance based on whether or not heaven showed its approval or its dissatisfaction.
Now let me tell you an interesting story that happened in the year 340 AD about a certain person who could have been one of my own ancestors, although I have no evidence to prove this fact. At that time, Ho Chung was the Secretary of State, and he also held the post Attorney General. And it was reported by the Astronomer Royal that the planet Mars was sighted near the star Zavizawa, which represented the post of the Attorney General. Now, that was regarded as a disastrous event, a disastrous omen for the Attorney General himself. Whereupon, Ho Chung, hoping to avert the calamity, asked the emperor to transfer him to another post. The logic behind it, of course, was that since he no longer held the position of Attorney General, he was absolved from all the responsibilities of the disasters predicted by the astronomer.
Despite the astrological emphasis, this interest in the heavens sparked an impressively detailed tradition of empirical observation. In the year 1054, a new object appeared in the sky, a star so bright that for a month it could be seen in daylight. To Today, all that remains is this, the spreading tendrils of the Crab Nebula. European observers did not record the appearance of this supernova. The Chinese did, and their pursuit of accurate astronomical knowledge spurred one of China's most impressive technological achievements, the discovery of a machine to measure time.
Well, the clock is, after all, one of the greatest measuring devices that mankind has ever invented. And what people generally don't realize is that the first invention of it was in China, the mechanical clock. This particular one is modeled on the Susong clock of 1084. A stream of water from a constant level tank poured into a bucket on the rim of the wheel like that. First of all, it tipped the counterweighted lever, and then it tipped another one, which allowed the next bucket to come through in the series.
The original timepiece stood 30 feet high and was set up in the grounds of the Imperial Palace at Kaifeng. It was the greatest in a series of monumental Sung Dynasty astronomical clocks. It was built, as its designer, the astronomer Su Song, wrote, to help him organize the calendar, promote good government, predict good and bad fortune, and study the resulting gains and losses. This model of Su Song's original clock exposes the extraordinary complexity of its design. Its careful gearing, driven by the great water wheel, operated a whole range of devices. Rotating figures told the time of day. Bells were rung every 2 hours, and drums were beaten at midnight and noon. On the top floor, a celestial globe told scholars which stars were rising and which setting. The Susong clock was the most accurate timepiece of its day, east or west. But the Susong clock was not accurate enough to improve on the quality of Chinese astronomical observations made with more traditional instruments, which reduced official interest in the device. Perhaps just as important, the precise measurement of time is essentially irrelevant to the needs of peasant farmers. Susong's extraordinary clock stood for less than 50 years. It was disassembled in 1127, never rebuilt, and in time, even the memory of the device was lost. But other scientific pursuits did not suffer the fate of the clock. Just as astronomy was driven by the needs of the emperor and his court, other traditional ideas, which may sound fanciful to modern ears, impel China to some of the most important discoveries of the pre-modern age. Fundamental knowledge in the field of physics. The Chinese possessed a concept of a vital flow or energy that runs through all of nature that they called qi. And it was this concept of qi that led the Chinese to a deep understanding of the phenomenon of magnetism. The Chinese pursued their study of magnetism in the context of the theory of geomancy, an elaborate system dedicated to the study of the lay of the land.
Geomancy was essentially an art of divination. The Chinese wanted to live in harmony with nature, and they wanted their dead to be buried in a way that would be in harmony with it. That meant that it was important for them to use every tool that was available. This is a fairly typical geomancer's compass. You see the pivoted needle in the middle, you see around it the diagrams that go back to the oldest Chinese book, the Book of Changes, the old divination book.
The The Chinese swiftly turned their invention to other purposes as well. By the 13th century, Chinese sailors were tracking their maritime compass bearings all the way across the South China Sea.
The Chinese, who were developing ideas of magnetism, were essentially indulging their curiosities. They were watching the world around them. They were trying to understand what they saw systematically. That's what physics has always been. If we want to look for our ancestors in Europe, then we have to look for them in China as well.
These ancient physicists were not the only ones to use the idea of qi. It was a notion that recurs throughout Chinese ideas about nature. For example, this general conception of a vital force was also applied to medicine. Great doctors were revered as semi-divine, as here at the Yaowang Temple near Xi'an, which honors Sun Shimao, a physician of the 7th century. Chinese still come here to pay their respects and seek the benefits of traditional Chinese medical wisdom. The temple also honors other doctors who are shown here in the characteristic robes and insignia of the scholar. Such early physicians developed the techniques of acupuncture, worked out the first method of smallpox inoculation, and even invented forensic medicine. They compiled their discoveries in huge encyclopedias. The first one was completed around 100 AD. This one, commissioned in 1057, took 25 years to complete, and it contains thousands of records of medicinal plants, prescriptions, and the appropriate treatments for disease. Such prescriptions are also carved on these stone tablets at the Yaowang Temple, treatments available still to any pilgrim. The basic text that underlay Chinese medical ideas and Chinese natural philosophy in general was the Book of Changes, the I Ching. It served as the inspiration for some of ancient China's most audacious investigations of nature. These men are Taoist priests. They take their inspiration from the sage Lao Tzu, a mysterious figure in Chinese history, said to have been an older contemporary of Confucius. Unlike the worldly scholar bureaucrats, Lao Tzu's followers were concerned with the search for the Tao, the way by which an individual may harmonize with the cosmic order. These Taoists chant to purify themselves and to focus the flow of qi through their own bodies. Taoist ideas of self-cultivation led to the theory of inner spiritual alchemy, through which the Taoist adept could achieve a form of immortality. With concentration, meditation, and the focus on their breathing, Taoists believed that they could refine themselves, eventually transforming their bodies and their minds into an immortal form. This Taoist diagram shows the path of the inner fire that could reveal an individual's very essence, a fire stoked in a cauldron near the base of the spine. But for some Taoists, this inner cultivation provided the inspiration for a more material discipline, an outer alchemy concerned with the transformation of metals and chemicals. By heating mixtures of mercury and sulfur, they produced cinnabar, a compound promoted as an elixir of immortality.
Nowadays, it's been widely accepted that modern chemistry has its origins in ancient Chinese alchemy. These immortality pills were found in the tomb of a woman who died 1,700 years ago during the Jin dynasty. After mixing sulfur, mercury, and other ingredients in this crucible, they were heated and reheated to produce an entirely new compound. As the pills were mainly mercuric sulfide, they were quite poisonous. They had some therapeutic use because the mercury content would kill bacteria.
Unfortunately, immortality compounds killed quite a few emperors and courtiers, who nonetheless were often depicted contemplating the joys of joining the gods high above the clouds. Such heavenly preoccupations did, however, result in the accumulation of some very down-to-earth chemical knowledge. The Arabs call this Chinese snow. It's saltpeter, commonly used in Taoist experiments. As early as the 11th century, the Chinese discovered that when saltpeter is mixed with charcoal and sulfur, the resulting compound would burn with intense heat. It was used as a fumigant and to treat skin conditions. Over the next few hundred years, Chinese chemists worked to increase the nitrate content of this compound, which we call gunpowder. They achieved spectacular results. But it wasn't all skyrockets and firecrackers. The Chinese rapidly produced quite lethal gunpowder weapons. Hand grenades, fire arrows, and rockets. Some were filled with arsenic and other substances and released poisonous gas. Others were packed with tar and oil and burned like napalm. To exploit the technology of gunpowder, the Sung emperors built a vast military-industrial complex. By the 13th century, the Bureau of Munitions possessed 7 factories and employed 40,000 workers. In one day, they could produce 17,000 rockets and 21,000 bombs, all under the direction of Confucian officials. The Sung military buildup was a matter of urgent necessity. Rich and innovative as the Sung Empire was, China remained vulnerable to attack from the nomad tribes of the north. By the end of the 11th century, the Qin Tartar were pressing hard against the borders of the Celestial Kingdom. By 1126, the Sung were forced to retreat south of the Yangtze River. The Qin Tartar ruled northeast China. And even further to the north, Mongol horsemen were beginning to stir from their grasslands along the steppes. The Sung regrouped after their defeat. The sweep of the Yangtze River presented a formidable natural barrier. and the Chinese constructed a vast navy to defend their new frontier. The spirit of innovation that marked the Sung remained as well, as the Chinese invented the world's first paddle boat to move troops around the shallow inland waterways. All of this cost a great deal, and the pressures of war, particularly the loss of tax revenues from the Tartar-controlled north, produced what seemed to be a dramatic shift in the bureaucratic priorities of China. After centuries of at least official reverence for agriculture over all other forms of economic activity, the Sung dynasty and its Confucian officials recognized the value of commerce, buying and selling, a sharp break from the agrarian focus of orthodox Confucian philosophy.
The Chinese empire depended basically on agrarian revenues. The tax was enough to keep the emperor pretty well off, as you all know from the imperial tombs and so on. They never really needed the merchants to that extent.
You know that in China there was the famous phrase, the four ranks of society, Shen Nung Gung Shang. The classes of society were the scholar bureaucrats at the top, and then the farmers, and then below them the artisans, the Gungren, and finally the merchants. They were in the last place of all. And although some of them became very wealthy, nevertheless no son of a rich merchant wanted to be a rich merchant in turn. He wanted to get in and take the imperial examinations and get into the civil service and become a gentleman, in fact.
For much of Chinese history, the rich merchant families of the Yangtze River Valley supplied a disproportionate number of successful bureaucrats. These officials became gentlemen and helped protect their families' business activities. But with the increased emphasis on commerce during the Sung, Chinese traders began to expand their contacts overseas, and ever more foreign merchants came in their turn to the great cities of southern China.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
Muslim traders traveled to Canton as early as 600 AD, and their descendants still come to the mosque to pray. During the Sung, Muslims served as agents who purchased and shipped the silks, tea, and porcelain of China for export to the Middle East and Europe. By the high seas and the Silk Roads, the luxuries of China flowed west. Merchants, Marco Polo included, traveled this Silk Road. They came for gain, and the riches involved were fabulous. Chinese silk, Chinese porcelain, rare and exotic goods all came to Europe this way. Arab physicians carried Chinese medical knowledge to Europe, which helped drive the Renaissance transformation of medicine. And the Chinese inventions of the crossbow and the cannon were to have a devastating impact on Europe. The battles fought between feudal territories prevented the kind of centralization that China had experienced. And as the 13th century progressed, feudal fiefs were beginning to transform themselves. They were becoming nation-states, which struggled fiercely among themselves for power. Italian merchants, for example, began the long, slow process of building their trading empires and of expanding the European horizon. Marco Polo's Venice was a shabby little town compared to Kublai's capitals. But that began to change as the merchants of Venice and Genoa gained wealth and power. They set up new institutions that fostered capitalism in Europe. Despite the growth of commerce during the Sung period, Chinese merchants never acquired the power to bring about such an economic transformation.
In Europe, there was no strong central state. You could have the Venetians running their own state, merchants dominating their own states. Genoans did the same. The Chinese could never do that. Their state was a centralized bureaucratic state. And therefore, if the merchants went too far or went beyond what the state wanted, the state would stop them.
But neither trade nor guns could halt the destruction of the Sung dynasty. The Mongols launched their invasion of China in 1205 and completed the conquest of the Sung in 1279. The invaders were still open to trade, but they were better conquerors than rulers. The nomadic Mongols never completely mastered the arts of ruling the settled civilization of China, and they held power for just 90 years.
The Ming Dynasty came on board and recognized that the agrarian empire had been threatened by the Mongols, who had been there for 100 years before that, and they wanted to re-endorse the agrarian nature of that empire. And then the role of the merchants had to be kept in place once more. No encouragement to merchants, and as a result of which, the merchants were told not to go overseas. Foreign trade was to be discouraged. If the Ming China wanted foreign trade, we'll invite foreign merchants to come and pay tribute to the Emperor of China, and we get foreign goods that way. We don't need to send our merchants out to get these things. We don't want Chinese to go out of the country. No need at all. You stay home and be good farmers, most of you, and that'll be fine.
The Ming Dynasty did mount one last startlingly bold international adventure. In 1405, the Ming Emperor dispatched the Admiral Chung He, called the Three-Jeweled Eunuch, on the first of 7 voyages south and west. Chung He's routes took him along the coast of Southeast Asia, India, Persia, and Arabia, and Chinese expeditions even ranged far down the east coast of Africa. These are copies of Chung He's charts. He had the ships and skills to continue around the Cape of Good Hope, but Europe would never see a fleet of Chinese junks sailing bravely into the Mediterranean. Chung He's last voyage came in 1433, and with it, the great age of Chinese maritime exploration came to an end. Instead, the initiative belonged to Henry the Navigator. Brother of the King of Portugal, he was determined to discover the seaborne route to Asia to break the monopolies on the eastern trade held by the Venetians and the Genoese. His ships took advantage of the best of Arab and Chinese design, with lateen sails, stern-post rudders, and compasses. These little craft, 1/5 the size of Chung He's massive junks, crept down the coast of Africa, bringing Europe closer to Asia, mile by mile, ship by ship. The dramatic push of European discovery was underway. This ancient beacon has guided mariners into the port of Quanzhou for over 1,000 years. Yet the arrival of a few Portuguese sailors along this coast early in the 1500s was a symbol of who was pushing hardest on the boundaries of knowledge. Gunpowder weapons were probably the last of the Sung innovations to have a major impact on the West, and the arrival of the Portuguese was a portent. From that moment on, European discoveries would begin to transform China. China had once possessed a fleet of 6,500 ships, but in the 1500s, the strange new European visitors did not seem to pose any threat to the self-sufficient Ming. Voyages of exploration became an expendable luxury, and the fleet was dispersed and allowed to rot away. It was the Grand Canal that eased the Chinese abandonment of the sea. Extending the Grand Canal was one of the Ming Dynasty's first projects. It transported goods and grain from the south of China 650 miles to the new capital of Beijing. The Grand Canal extension was completed in 1415, and it helped the Ming refocus China's commerce inward, shifting the emphasis from foreign trade to trade within the vast internal market. The choice appealed to the traditional values of the scholar bureaucrats who, in centuries past, had pursued China's extraordinary flowering of culture and scientific investigation. And it made sense because the system worked within the priorities of Confucian culture. Discovery and change were irrelevant so long as the empire was rich, stable, and at peace.
From hindsight, it's natural to think that any society wants to change, and that if they stop changing, it's because of a conscious decision. But that's not true of traditional societies. They're hoping to survive and minimize instability. That's the best they can hope for. It's the acceleration of change in the West that's the aberration. That's what needs explanation. That's precisely what remains a mystery to us. The Chinese were making just as rational a decision as the Europeans were. It was a decision of a different kind, and it made sense in their context.
And so Confucian bureaucrats tried to bury even the memory of such unsettling events as China's voyages of discovery. But if ending China's seafaring days was sound Confucian policy, the decision was still a symptom of the increasing caution that characterized the Ming. Song China, and even the Mongol-ruled empire that Marco Polo knew, was a vital, dynamic place, with Chinese culture embracing new ideas, new thoughts, even new men, Marco Polo for one. In the 15th century, China was still the richest and most advanced nation on earth, but the momentum had already begun to shift.